Well, let's go back to Kerry and his expression, his views, and his explanation, outlining of the positions of the Obama administration. He talks about the invasion of Gaza, different than Obama, who omitted it. But his position is the standard one, in fact, universal position. He said that, incidentally, the invasion was, of course, in violation of international law, but also in violation of U.S. law. U.S. law very explicitly bars the use of U.S. weapons for anything but strictly defensive purposes. And can't pretend that in this case, but that's kind of overlooked. We don't care about U.S. law any more than about international law. But he justified the invasion in the universally accepted terms. He said that, I'll quote him, if terrorists in Quincy, Massachusetts were launching rocket attacks in Boston, we'd have to put a stop to it, just as the Israelis were forced to respond to Gaza. And again, that's Obama's statement about what I would do if my daughters were being attacked by missiles. And that's pretty near universal. Look pretty far or something. There is debate about whether the Israeli attack was disproportionate, but there's no debate about the fact that it was necessary, it justified self-defense. Well, that's not only false, but it's transparently false. It's false in unarguable fashion. The issue, which is constantly evaded, is not whether Israel had a right to defend itself. Sure, everyone has a right to defend themselves. The issue was that they have a right to defend themselves by force. That's a totally different question. Nobody in Washington or anywhere else accepts the principle that every state has the right to defend itself by force. So when, for example, Vladimir Putin invaded Chechnya and practically destroyed the place, he claimed correctly that it was a reaction to Chechen terror, which was pretty awful. But it wasn't praised here or anywhere. In fact, it was bitterly condemned because he had a way to resolve to eliminate the terror without force. And withdraw from Chechnya. When the British Army was in the United States in the 1770s, they had a right to defend themselves from the terror of George Washington's army, which was incidentally very real. But they didn't have a right to defend themselves by force, because there was a way to settle it without force. Leave the country. So the real, and you can give case after case. The question is, did Israel have a right to defend itself by force? Had they exhausted peaceful means? That's the crucial question. And the reason the issue is evaded, because the answer to that question is transparent. They had not even tried peaceful means, because they didn't want them. There are peaceful means which are narrow, which would have sufficed, namely to accept a ceasefire. Hamas repeatedly offered a ceasefire right up to the invasion. And in fact, there had been a ceasefire in June 2008, one of many. And like every other one, Israel didn't live up to it. So the ceasefire of June 2008, there was an agreement. Israel would put an end to the siege, open the borders, and Hamas would put an end to rockets. Well, Hamas lived up to it. Israel did invade in November 2008, killed half a dozen Palestinians. But up until that invasion, the Israeli government concedes that there wasn't a single rocket. Okay, so it lived up to it totally, while Israel didn't live up to it at all. It maintained the siege. The siege is an act of war, and a very brutal act of war in this case. Nevertheless, Hamas lived up to it. Well, after Israel broke the partial ceasefire, unilateral ceasefire, again were repeated offers of ceasefire, and Israel rejected them. They were up to right before the invasion. So there was a very narrow way for Israel to put an end to rocket fire, if it's heard about it. But there's also a broader and more important way, which is similar to Putin in Chechnya and the British in the colonies, Israel could stop the criminal activities in the West Bank, and in Gaza for that matter. And that they are criminal activities is not in doubt, as I mentioned. So they could put an end to the criminal activities, and presumably would put an end to the resistance to them. It's pretty hard to argue that people don't have a right to resistance to constant, ongoing criminal attacks on them. So, okay, that's a broader way to defend themselves against rocket fire. The conclusion is that there was no justification whatsoever for Israel to invade Gaza. And the reasons are really not debatable. I mean, they're transparent. They're based on a principle that everyone accepts. And we not only accept, but insist upon in the case of our enemies. Namely, the use of force is not legitimate unless peaceful means have been exhausted. If they have, you can then debate whether the use of violence is legitimate. Indeed, it's still a burden of proof, but you can't raise the question if peaceful means have been rejected. So the universal assent, your universal assent to the idea that Israel had a right to invade Gaza is just pure hypocrisy, just a reflection of the depth of imperial mentality. Well, let's return to Kerry's thesis that now, at last, there's a legitimate Palestinian partner for peace. There wasn't one before, but he goes on to say now there is one. The legitimate, I think it's a very interesting argument for that. The legitimate partner for peace, he said for the first time, is now Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah. Let's review a few facts about them and the rest of Palestine. In January 2006, there was an election, a free election. A lot of observers ratified as a free election. In fact, the only one in the Arab world. It came out the wrong way. The United States and Israel didn't like the outcome of the election, and so therefore they reacted in a standard fashion, and by punishing the population for the crime of voting the wrong way in a free election, and punishing very harshly. The punishment was extreme. In the case of Israel, assassinations and so on, but it also went even as far as cutting off the flow of clean water to the arid Gaza Strip, where you can't, sewage, everything else is destroyed. It's very hard to get any water. They cut off the water. The United States